organizers. We are in purple shirts. Oh. Ah, okay. Great. So that's sorted. Let's give it up for Tara and Matty.
Hey, it all works. Fantastic. I love my super expensive presentation remote because half the time it doesn't work at all. So it's money well spent. So I know I am the one standing between you and lunch and most importantly, beer. So bear with me. We're going to go on a little bit of a journey. We're going to think about some emotional health stuff. We're going to think about how we can learn how our organization can get better with dealing with things that are traumatic to an organization. And just like earlier, Eric gave us some metaphors and analogies about the power company and how that goes to cloud. I'm doing some analogy here too, so we'll see how it comes along. So this is called Fight, Flight, or Freeze, Releasing Organizational Trauma. The title of the talk is basically longer than the entire talk. So next year I promise to think about having more, a little more brevity in my talk titles. Okay, so anyway, just a quick introduction to get that out of the way. So my name is Matty Stratton. That's me on Twitter. So I work for PagerDuty. And how many people are familiar with PagerDuty? Cool, great, okay, now I can be done talking about PagerDuty. PagerDuty pays my bills for me coming here, so we talk about that. If you'd like to talk more about PagerDuty, we can do that later. The rest of my talk, I may talk about some things about how we do work at PagerDuty. And I also have count it, one more of those cute pagey stickers. So I may figure out a clever way to give that away at the end of the talk. And kind of really the point of a resume slide like this is to create some validation as to why should you listen to me? You know, why am I someone, you know, that you should listen to my opinion and my experiences and everything, and really this is why. This is my burden in that I can't actually cut my hair anymore now because it's a brand thing. So anyway, so let's move along here. Couple quick little disclaimers, content warnings. So there is discussion of trauma and post-traumatic stress. I'm not going to speak about specific traumas, but you know, be aware that we'll be talking about post-traumatic stress. And then also, so I'm a trauma survivor. So a little bit over a year ago, I spent about 4 to 5 weeks in a rehab facility for post-traumatic stress and depression. And this is where I learned a lot of these techniques around what we do to treat post-traumatic stress, and this is where kind of the ideas for this talk came from. So that's my background from that. What I am not is a mental health professional, right? So this should not be interpreted as mental health advice. I'm not a doctor. I don't even play one on TV. But let's start by considering a zebra, right? Imagine a zebra, and if you can't imagine a zebra, there's a picture of one that will help. So a zebra that's at rest with no threat of predators is, for instance, operating within what's called the rest and digest functions of the parasympathetic nervous system. Zebra's sitting there, eating some grass, maybe thinking about making little baby zebras, being a chill zebra, right? Now, what happens when a lion starts chasing the zebra? This is a thing that happens, right? These drastic physiological changes occur with the activation of what's called the fight or flight response of the sympathetic nervous system. So the heart rate increases, the pupils dilate, the blood pressure increases, large levels of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline are released into the zebra's bloodstream, and all non-essential functions like digestion shut down. The zebra's nervous system is preparing for it to run for its life. Now, what happens if the zebra gets caught? What happens is it shuts down, it plays dead. This is the freeze response because the nervous system is overwhelmed at this point and it has no further solutions. So it freezes. And maybe the lion drops the zebra, then moves on and maybe go try to catch another one, and the zebra might be able to get away. And what does the zebra do if it's able to get away? it stands up and it shakes. It actually shakes and it returns back to rest and digest. So it's able to say this event occurred, and it literally shakes it off, right? And it returns back to this resting state. Now, there's a lot of learning that happens at Devopsdays. You know, we've gone down quite a journey over the last 2 days. We've learned about, different metaphors for the cloud. We've learned about observability. We've learned about how to refactor our architects and everything. But I'm about to tell you probably the most important thing that you're going to learn at this Devopsdays. So be ready for some real thought leadership here. This is the slide you want to take a picture of. Humans are not zebras. So if you learn nothing else over these 2 days, learn that we aren't zebras. And what do I mean by that? So the autonomic nervous system is common to all mammals. That's that fight or flight response, right? It happens to all of us. All mammals have this. But humans have this thing called a prefrontal cortex, and zebras do not, and other mammals don't. And the prefrontal cortex is usually an advantage, right? This is where executive functioning happens. This is where understanding the difference between good and bad, same and different, pattern recognition, all these things happen because we have a prefrontal cortex. It's what separates us. There's a disadvantage though, right? You know, with everything, there's trade-offs all the time. And the disadvantage is that we mentally replay traumatic scenarios, which activates our sympathetic nervous system exactly like the real threat would. So here's the thing. So the human brain is an amazing thing, and we're very brilliant, and it does all these complicated things. And here's the other thing. It's really stupid, right? And it can't tell the difference between real and perceived threat. So we actually physiologically respond the same to the memory of trauma as we do to when it really happens. So I didn't come up with that zebra metaphor by myself. That story that actually comes from Dr. Peter Levine, who has done a lot of work around post-traumatic stress and somatic experiencing. And so he kind of summarizes by saying, animals in the wild, they're not traumatized by routine threats to their lives. Just like we said, the zebra shakes it off. Humans, we're readily overwhelmed, and we're subject to traumatic symptoms of hyperarousal, shutdown, and dysregulation. So that's the fancy version of the humans aren't zebras slide, right? Okay, so this is, if we think about a healthy nervous system, this is kind of how things happen, right? So we're not always like right there in the middle. We do go back and forth between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, just like the zebras do. So there's arousal activation, something happens that triggers our fight or flight response, which is the sympathetic nervous system. We get activated, but then we come back down, we settle. And then we keep going, it's kind of in a wave. And as long as we're operating within this range, this healthy range, this is called the window of tolerance. And the window of tolerance is this zone of emotional arousal that's optimal for well-being and effective functioning. So this is okay, right? This is kind of as we are. I hate to say normal, but it says normal range, and why would a slide lie to a person? So now let's think about a different way, right? Now when we think about trauma, so when we have undischarged traumatic stress, what can happen when a traumatic event occurs that kicks us off beyond just that activation? You can either kind of do this crazy fluctuation, right, where we're up and we're down and we're up and we're down, or we can also get stuck on, or we could get stuck off. So some of the symptoms, like if we're stuck on, that's where anxiety and panic come in, digestive problems. If we're stuck off, there's lethargy and depression, and also more digestive problems because the body and the mind are so well connected. So, I like this, because it's like we're, kind of ops and observability and everything. It sort of looks like a graph, right? Like we're like, this is like a really messed up Nagios kind of situation there. So this is, again, hyperarousal, which is being stuck on, is similar to always being in fight or flight. And hypo arousal, which is stuck is off, is always being in freeze. Now here's the thing. Trauma is not simple, right? It's complex, just like the systems we operate, right? So there's a lot of nuance to that, and this is really where things get pretty tricky. So really, it's the nervous system's been overwhelmed, right? So trauma basically is when, as one solution, the active response to threat doesn't work, right? So just because something bad happens does not necessarily mean it's trauma. What trauma is when our solution does not work. Our nervous system can't handle it. The nervous system activation is the same for real and imagined threats, right? So whether it's an actual physical threat that's happening or just the perception of one, the nervous system activates the same way and our body reacts the exact same way. And it's also subjective and relative, and this is really key, right? So what I perceive as overwhelming or my capacity for a solution might be different than yours. When I was in treatment, there were people in treatment for trauma that, you know, I'm not going to go into the detail, but there were things from the military, they'd gone through some really serious shit. And I was kind of like, wow, I really don't feel like I belong here because you've been through much, much worse. But the reality is, it's nuanced and it's different. And another thing to think about when it comes to this is trauma is not a zero-sum game, right? My trauma, my experience does not take away from yours, right? You may have it worse than I did, and that's totally true, but that doesn't negate the fact that I may have had this experience. And that's something we sometimes have a really hard time thinking about because we like to play whataboutism, right? Which is, again, I'm a very privileged person, so like the things I have to deal with are much maybe easier to deal with than people who don't come from a position of privilege, but that doesn't mean that my trauma isn't real. So how does this apply to an organization or a company though, right? We're here at Devopsdays. We're here to learn the supposed about organizational trauma. So you're like, great, okay. So we're setting the stage for the metaphor. Here we go, let's see how it goes. So we go back and we think about the window of tolerance again when we have this. And so I want you to imagine that the traumatic event is a severe incident or outage, right? One where, again, so the normal window of tolerance of your organization is things can happen, you respond to them, then you go back to business as usual. But sometimes we have severe incidents and severe outages where our capacity for a solution does not work, and it causes challenge. And we can get, similarly, undischarged traumatic stress to the organization. The organization operates, the organism of the company is very similar to the organism of an individual when this happens. And so we talked about hyper arousal, which is fight or flight. That's being stuck on. So what does that look like in a company, right? So a hyper aroused organization, they display effects of constant vigilance. I feel like they're fighting Voldemort, right? They're like, okay, they're hyper aware of threats, which takes energy away from moving forward. Does this mean we should not be aware of threats? Does this mean we shouldn't be defending ourselves? Absolutely not. But these are organizations where that is where all of the focus is on, and it's always kind of looking over your shoulder. And a lot of times this is reflected in how leadership approaches outages and issues. See a lot of wartime metaphors, right? A lot of military metaphors when it comes in. Production support teams tend to be a symptom of an organization like this because it's saying we need to be mobilized for incidents, right? But also the belief is that we're going, so we're assuming that they're happening all the time, and then that thing is we don't have the energy to innovate. Then on the other side, we can be frozen, right, in a hypo-aroused organization. And this is nuanced a little bit different. They're stuck off. So this is the organization that believes we can prevent incidents and outages because we just won't move, right? So we won't make any change. We're going to be stuck off. And there's, again, everybody kind of does this different ways, and an organization is not always stuck on and always stuck off, and sometimes the same organization can also do this, right? But the problem is when we're dysregulated like that, it's an extreme, right? So one thing I want to think about is inappropriate response, right? And what happens here is it's how do we respond to things? Now, as humans, we like pattern recognition. This is a thing we love. It's that prefrontal cortex. We want to say, this is like something I've seen before, right? And we may see signals that remind us of something that happened before, and then it's going to activate us to respond the way we responded last time. But here's the thing. It's 2019, right? Our systems are really complex. nothing is the same as it ever was. This is, we're not running our lamp stack on one server with 10 users that are all doing the same kind of thing. Nothing against the lamp stack. The thing is, our complexity of systems makes this inappropriate. I used to say, when I ran sysadmin teams 10, 15 years ago, I used to say, you know what, a good sysadmin is someone who sits there and goes, yeah, I've seen this before. I don't believe that anymore, because when you do that, you're probably going to go back and you say, this looks like a thing that happened before, but things are complex. We're going to talk about that. So think about this. How many people have had to fly inside the United States? Okay, my condolences. So, you're familiar with having to take off your shoes, unless, yeah. So, in December 22nd of 2001, this cat named Richard Reed, he tried to ignite explosives hidden in his shoes on a flight from Paris to Miami. So, as a result, the US TSA started randomly searching people's shoes, because there was a signal similarity. They're like, well, some dude tried to blow up shoes, so therefore, shoes are a thing that people might want to blow up. So let's do that. Then in 2006, the TSA mandated that all passengers had to remove their shoes going through security, unless you now pay them $100 and give up all your privacy, and then you can leave your shoes on. So that's a whole other conversation about security theater. But what's happening there is, again, it's looking for a signal, a pattern recognition. The pattern is, well, okay, it's shoes, right? We're going to over-respond to that, right, rather than looking for the nuance. And here's another way to think about this. So Jennifer Brea says, we have a saying in medicine that when you hear hoofbeats, the first thing that should come to mind is a horse, not a zebra. Well, that sounds logical, right? Then she says, this too cute by half phrase has killed so many zebras. And we need to learn to stop jumping on the first root cause. And I'm going to start this. I gave this talk a couple days ago, and I asked this question. I want to see the answer here. We're going to compare you to DevOps Enterprise Summit, because those were the management people that are disconnected, but we're all very smart here. How many people are familiar with the idea that the term root cause is maybe not so good? Okay. Does anybody know what the better term is? Okay, that's okay. Contributing factors. So we're all going to learn that term today. And the reason, there's two reasons. One is, first of all, there is no root cause. I'm sorry, there is one root cause. You want to know what the root cause of everything is? The Big Bang. Okay? So what we do here is we look for this pattern, and so when we're resolving and we're working in an incident, one thing is that we naturally want to look for what caused it, right? That's part of the thing. And the reality is, in good incident response, you actually are first and foremost primarily focused on restoring service, right? We will look for contributing factors. We will understand them later in our post-incident review or in our post-mortem. But the thing is, if we are thinking about root cause, and with the first thing we see that looks like a pattern, we're going to say, okay, it's a horse. Boom, but you know what? Maybe it's a zebra, right? So we need to be able to be to seeing that nuance. So what you want to do is you want to be able to take this is a takeaway. This is your homework, right? After the weekend, don't do it this weekend. But when you go back to work on Monday, start to think about what your own organization's window of tolerance looks like, because that window is different for every organization, right? Like when you become stuck on or stuck off is different depending on if you're Netflix or if you're a bank or if you're PagerDuty, or whoever you're at. But what you want to be able to say, how will we understand when we become dysregulated? You need to be aware of that, because then we can actually take some action. So if we talked about, what Dr. Levine said about how zebras are different than humans, right? Because the zebras can do that. So a similar way to think about this, another quote, is that resilient organizations are not traumatized by routine threats to their mission or business. We have these all the time. These are routine threats. A resilient organization is not traumatized by it, but non-resilient organizations are overwhelmed and often subject to the symptoms of overreaction, shutdown, and lack of regulated effort. And this comes from this guy. I'm not a doctor, so take that as you will. But that's sort of taking that's the analogy that we're going for. And so we want to think about, how do we take a deregulated state and become regulated. So we figured out we are deregulated. You're like, great, we're dysregulated. What do we do about it, right? So first we're going to talk a little bit about how we handle this in post-traumatic stress in individuals, and then we will figure out how to do that for an organization. So one of the treatments for post-traumatic stress is something called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, hereafter referred to as EMDR, because that is really hard to say. And so what happens there is the difficult memories, the memories of trauma, are offset by physical stimuli, right? You create a positive association, but then both the left and right sides of the brain are activated to kind of hammer home that physiological association, right? Is kind of how that works. Well, how can we do that for our company, right? We're not going to sit down and have all of our developers sit there with flashing lights on either side or blinking tappers while we're going through this, but what can we do to achieve a similar thing where we want to create a physiological association with safety? So we can do this with game days, right, is one way. So game days are kind of when we're sitting there and we say we're going to exercise, we're going to do practice. We're going to practice incident response, we're going to practice an outage, we're going to practice a thing. What we want to do is make an association of incidents and issues with this safe place. So game days can help us do this, right? But they have to be done properly. And you want to keep them low stress and safe. And here's why. The point of a game day is not to practice under pressure. It's not to train your people how to deal with stress. Trust me, real incidents will give them plenty of practice with stress. What we're actually trying to do is go through the motions and the exercises of our incident response process in a calm way, so we create this physiological response. So we need to be able to, it's sort of like meditation, right? When you're going through meditation, for treatment for post-traumatic stress, you have to have guidance, because you need to be able to, and so the same way your game days have to be organized, right? It has to be that we are actually running this like an incident, and because we're practicing it, and we all know it's practice, and that's fine. We're not trying to trick anybody, right? The goal of this, in fact, also, game days are not exercises in practicing troubleshooting. They are exercises in practicing the process, so that when it really happens at 3 in the morning, it just reminds us of when we did it at 2 in the afternoon on Tuesday. It's just a thing that we do, right? And then taking this to another level, when we think about planned failure injection or chaos engineering. So if you do planned failure injection as part of your game day, which I recommend, run it like a real incident. So on PagerDuty, we have something we call Failure Fridays. So on Fridays, we do failure injection on a service. We sit there and we take something down. Well, hopefully we don't actually take it down, but we inject failure into a service, and we run that following our full incident command process. Now, it's not an exercise in troubleshooting, because guess what? We totally know what's wrong, because we broke it, right? But what we're doing there is we're practicing doing incident response, and it's awesome because it's great practice for incident commanders. In fact, before you go on call as an incident commander at PagerDuty, you need to run a Failure Friday, because it gives you that practice. And then the teams that are doing that, is because they're all incident responders as well, so it's creating this practice, and we do it on Fridays in the middle of like around lunchtime. And part of that is because, first of all, we're PagerDuty. There is no maintenance window. There's no good time for us to be down. In fact, the best time for us to run any kind of risk is during the day when everybody's in the office, right? So if something happens, everyone's all hands on deck. But the other thing is, it's just kind of a chill Friday afternoon thing. So we're just used to that. And then when we have real incidents, everyone's gone through this process, and we just have this physical association. This is also why you should run all your incidents at their initial severity. So this will happen sometimes, right? Like you spin up an incident because the thing happens, and then you realize nothing's actually broken, it's actually totally fine. What we do is we still actually run it out through its course. We still run our whole process. And there's 2 reasons for doing that. So one is, and it's mostly associated to this conversation right now, is again, it's just giving us more practice. We want it so that incident response is just this thing that we do, right? It's not stressful. It's not like, oh my God, what's gonna happen? Because everything about being on call is designed to be stressful. So we wanna make it so it's not like, oh, please, please, please don't let something happen because I don't know what I'm gonna do. It's like, oh, it's just a thing that's gonna happen. The other reason that you don't, I like to say, don't litigate severity, which is why during an incident, you don't spend a lot of time arguing about, was it a Sev 1, was it a Sev 2? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One being is by the time you're done fighting about it, it's actually probably become a Sev 1 anyway, right? And then also, again, everything should be about restoring service. There's a couch right there. All right, cool. We have to process our failure, right? So blamelessness is just the beginning. Like when you're doing your postmortems, your post-incident reviews, yes, they need to be blameless and they need to be blame aware, but that's not enough, right? We have to process this failure and outage through all the information that we have, and that processing has to have a conclusion. So a lot of times we do a really good job and we're like, we got our postmortem template, you know, and we do, after an incident, we diligently fill it out, you know, it's like we're doing our tax form. And you know what? And it gets shoved off into Confluence or into Google Drive. And that is what I call a write-only postmortem, right? And it doesn't help anybody. So for a couple of reasons. One is nobody's learned, but also the people who experienced the outage did not get to process it, right? There's this misconception in trauma treatment that to process it, we have to just sort of get it all out. But what we have to really do is integrate that experience into our coherent whole, which includes telling our stories as well as changing our autonomic nervous systems. And this has to do with how we respond to outages and incidents. So we have to tell stories. One thing that I find really interesting, so my friend Paul Reed did his dissertation on postmortems in IT. And one of the things he found in his research was the larger the organization, the less likely teams were to share their postmortems outside of their team. The irony of this is the larger the organization, the more important it is because our systems are interconnected. But that's not the only reason you need to share your postmortems. It's not just because people need to have the information, but it's because of the storytelling, right? It's how we actually process that, and our organization just gets better from doing that. So we talk a little bit about something called somatic experiencing. So in top-down therapy, which is kind of traditional talk therapy, we start with our emotions. Why do we feel the way that we do? That's very similar to looking for root cause right away. In somatic experiencing, the body is worked with first, which enables this titrated approach to the emotions. So we kind of talk about getting the body the way we want to feel, and then we layer on the memories and the emotions. So this is, during an incident, we're working to restore service. We're starting with that. We're not looking to determine contributing factors. And then kind of finally to wrap some things up to some more actionable things to keep in mind, I'm going to talk about these things called cognitive distortions. And they're exactly what their name implies. They're distortions in how we think. They're perspectives with bias. So these patterns and thoughts are often really subtle. It's hard to recognize them when they're a regular feature of how we operate in our day-to-day thoughts. So there's as many as 16 generally accepted cognitive distortions. I am not going to go through all of them. We're just going to touch on a few that, to me, I've seen us in tech and in IT and in DevOps and organizations, these may be causing issues. So one is called polarized thinking. This is also known as all or nothing thinking. This is when we see everything in extremes. It's either perfection or total failure, right? So remember, our systems are always in some degraded state. There is no perfection. And so it doesn't mean that just because we have some degradation, everything is terrible. Everything is terrible, but that's not why. Overgeneralization. This is where we take a single instance and we generalize it to an overall pattern, right? On a personal level, this could be like, well, I got a 50% on this test, so I'm stupid and a failure, right? In an organization, this could be, well, we had the Sev 1 incident on this particular service, so it's super unstable and not fall, right? And when we compare this with another distortion called the mental filter, this manifests as only seeing the negative and eliminating all positives about a situation. I used to say that good sysadmins were inherently pessimistic. I don't know that I believe that anymore. it may be true, but that mental filter can happen where we're always looking for the negative. We're only seeing the negative things about what's happening in our organization, where it's hard to see the positives. Fortune telling, so we do this a lot in tech, right? We feel like if we have enough data, we can be predictive. Machine learning, anybody, right? So if we only know enough, we can predict the future. Yeah, well, we can start to get ideas on what's likely to happen, but these systems are complex, our users are complex. So we have to be able to understand that our predictions are not fact, but actually just one of several positive outcomes. Control fallacies. So this can be two beliefs. One can be that we have no control over our lives and we're helpless victims of fate, or we are in complete control over everything and then we have responsibility for everyone around us. So they're both damaging and they're both also completely inaccurate. So no one's in complete control over everything that happens to them, and also no one is completely out of control. One way that I see this manifest, so my background is in ops. So what do we think in ops? We're like, if we could just control those developers, then the system would be fine, right? And so that's one way that this can come out. The other one is to feel like we have no control as well. Management is just dictating everything, right? I have no influence. I have no control. What we do is we have control over how we respond and how we can try to influence. So Dr. Levine says resilient strength is the opposite of helplessness. So what does being resilient mean? Being resilient means that we don't see things from the perspective of things that happen to us. It's a matter of what we can do going forward. A culture of blame creates a culture of helplessness. Thank you, Amsterdam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matty. We will take one question.
Oh, and that's whoever asks the question gets the Pagey sticker.
There you go. 2 hour questions.
Oh, there's.
All right. Can you do
We'll see.
throw thingy?
Hi. Do you have any tips on how to identify early onset of PTSD from on-call?
Okay, so that's a whole open state. So the question, right, was how can we see from being on call, like seeing burnout coming or seeing post-traumatic stress coming? So we've done a lot of research on this at PagerDuty, and I'm not going to talk about all of it right now because we don't have a lot of time, but hit me up later and I can point you towards a survey we did. But I will tell you one thing, that just one of the things we've seen is there's a lot of factors that you can look at with data, and we've started to do that in our product. But like, for example, one thing is how quickly people or how slowly people respond. So actually when people are starting to get burnt out and starting to get that type of thing from being on call, they're actually slower to respond to pages. But this is why you need to look at data with nuance, because what do a lot of managers look at that and they go, oh, well, you're doing a shitty job, right? Instead of, wait a minute, we need to actually figure out what is going on there. The best way to kind of identify as well is also if you're doing operational reviews, so like on-call handoffs, is checking in and saying like, what was that like? Because a lot of times this stuff doesn't surface and we don't realize how often people are being called if we don't talk about it. And I hear there are products that can help you see how often you're being paged and stuff, but what also helps more than anything else is just having it be part of maybe a daily handoff or week or whenever your handoffs happen. So.
Cool, thanks.
And I will get you your sticker.
Thank you so much, Matty.
Thank you.
Thanks again. So, before we head off for lunch, I want to